Welcome to our community forum. I'm Tim Madigan, and today's guest is Professor Ed O'Shea. Please stay with us. Professor Ed O'Shea is an emeritus English professor from SUNY Oswego. His lifelong career emphasis has been on Irish poetry. He published and taught NEH seminars for many years on the poetry of W.B. Yeats. In 2015, he turned to Yeats' successor, Seamus Heaney, and he's completing work on a study of Heaney's teaching and poetry readings in the United States over a period of 30 years, entitled Seamus Heaney's American Odyssey. And Ed, you gave a talk here at Fisher about a week ago on your book.
I did.
I thought we'd begin by, if you're just talking about the connection between Yeats and Heaney. They both, of course, won the Nobel Prize for Literature.
Right, that's right. I mean, last week I think you made the observation that the year that Yeats died, Seamus Heaney was born.
It's a little scary, given that
yeah.
Yeats was really into transmigration of souls.
Yes, interesting idea that maybe Yeats' soul should have become, you know, Heaney's soul in a sense, right? But I think Heaney would certainly reject that idea. But certainly the continuity between the two is just really amazing. Of course, the contrasts are important too, but Robert Lowell called Seamus Heaney the most famous Irish poet after Yeats.
Yeah.
And that was that was something that was high praise, you know, coming from Robert Lowell, but at the same time, it put a big target on Heaney's back. Okay, and his fellow poets in the North were often taking sniping at him for, you know, his exalted reputation, but they couldn't be different in some ways either. And so Yeats, of course, was born in this kind of aristocratic, even sort of middle class background. His father was an artist. His father said to him once that I would not be content for you just to be a gentleman. You must be more than a gentleman. You must be an artist. Okay. But Heaney's family, of course, was a rural farming family from the north of Ireland, and his father was a cattle broker, essentially. And he was the first one in his family to go to college. And so Yeats, on the other hand, did go to college, but it was an art college. So there is a sense that Heaney that considered a considerable stretch to go from being a rural child in Northern Ireland to becoming a poet. And when he first began writing poetry, he published under the name Incertus. So
really?
Being a good Latin person yourself, you would understand that. So uncertain. He was not certain of his career at that point. Yeah. But the ramifications are so great. I mean, they both, in a sense, represented their both time period, but also their place in Ireland. And they both became sort of, in a sense, spokespersons for their place in Ireland, in a way, you know. Yeah.
Well, we were talking earlier about Yeats, his famous poem Easter 1916, about the rising.
Right.
And whatever his intentions were, he's always will be identified with the major changes that happened in Ireland,
right,
at the turn of the 20th century.
Yeah.
And likewise with Heaney, the events with the Troubles and
yes.
In fact, what's still going on in
That's right.
the island of Ireland.
Yeah. Most people don't realize about Yeats' Easter 1916 that he looked at the rising with sort of a skeptical eye.
Yeah.
And he said to Lady Gregory, I think, after the rising happened, he said, that's the end of the work we've been doing for 25 years. In other words, the cultural revolution in Ireland, he understood to be kind of displaced by the political revolution in Ireland. And he was very skeptical about the Irish Revolution. In fact, the Easter 1916 is about that. It's Yeats' sort of apology for being very sort of critical of the individuals who took part in the rising. And this was his very conscious apology to those people. So even though he's known for a poet who celebrated the Easter Rising, he began with a very strong skepticism about the rising. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Well, and as you have written on, both Yeats and Heaney have great complexities in their poetry. It's very hard to
yes.
just simplify what their meanings are.
Right. And Heaney was, essentially, he was almost dragged into writing political poetry by the events that he experienced, and also certain pressures from the people around him in a way. That he was essentially, I think, a more private kind of poet in a way. And he reluctantly became a political poet. But his moment in history almost forced him to do that, in a sense. Yeah.
No, that's fascinating. As you say, there's the poetry, the personal poetry, trying to capture love relationships
Yes.
or what have you. But then, like it or not, the complexities of politics.
That's right.
Both of them are almost expected to comment.
Yeah. And I think they both got the Nobel Prize for Literature because the Nobel Committee recognized the fact that they were regional poets in the best sense. That Yeats represented the south of Ireland in a very special kind of way, and that Seamus Heaney did in the north too. And so, again, an incredible coincidence that they both received the Nobel Prize for Literature, and that Heaney basically constructed his Nobel speech on Yeats's Nobel speech, and made
Really?
constant reference to it in a sense. Yes,
that's
he did.
interesting. I
Yeah,
didn't know that.
yeah.
Now, what year did Heaney get the Nobel Prize?
1995.
Okay.
Yeah, 1995.
And in the talk you gave here at Fisher about Heaney's time in America, if I recall correctly, when he first came over, he really wasn't that well known.
It is interesting. I mean, you and I talked last week about that article that's appeared in the New Yorker lately about Seamus Heaney, the happy poet, the
Yeah.
happiest of poet. And I think that the word that he probably would have used instead of happiest would have been luckiest, because he always considered himself lucky. And actually, when he was first at Berkeley in 1970 and 71, he was not well known, but there was a sense among the people in the English department, among his students, that this was a person who was really quite special. And in the second term that he taught at Berkeley, he did a reading tour around the United States, or northern United States, and he ended up in New York at the 92nd Street Y in 1971. And we don't have a video recording of him reading at that time. We have an audio recording. And from his own testimonial, it was a very large group of people. And in New York, yes, it was. It was a very, very large audience. So very quickly, his poetry and his reputation caught on. So yes, he did start somewhat unknown, but his reputation just sort of took off, I guess you would say, in this country. And a lot of it had to do with the troubles back in the north.
Well, that's what I was wondering, as you talk about the regional connection, that even if one knew nothing about him, I suppose you said, well, we have a poet from the north during the times, really the early times of the Troubles, which was certainly getting a great amount of attention in the United States.
Yes.
That might have in part attracted the audiences.
Absolutely. It was absolutely the case that, especially in the East, but throughout the United States, there was a tremendous interest in what was happening in the North. The civil rights movement that was just beginning in 1968 in the North, and that Heaney was a part of in a certain sense. And I think the American audiences had a sense that Heaney could give them a really good insight to what was happening there. And he could.
And can you say a little bit, you mentioned his father and his sort of rural upbringing. What about religion? What role did that play?
He was raised in a very traditional and strict Irish Catholic upbringing. Yes, he was. And, he was immersed in it. He was totally saturated in this Irish Catholic culture. And, to the point where his mother would go to Mass every day, and he would often go with her until he went away to boarding school. But I would say more than Heaney being a Catholic poet, he's a poet whose poetry is saturated with Catholic imagery, but not necessarily in a kind of Orthodox Catholic manner, in a sense, right? In other words, he's always skewing the Catholic imagery in interesting kinds of ways. You know, I talked about this skunk the other day in the lecture that I gave, and to reference the Catholic Mass of the Dead in the context of a domestic poem, really, which is really about his wife and he back in their bedroom in Belfast and he in California at the time. It's a very strange kind of reference, and that keeps us off balance, I think, as readers.
So this, just jumping ahead to the skunk, when did he write that? What period of time?
That would be, so he was at Berkeley in 1976, and so the skunk was a couple of years later, probably 78, 80.
It was before he won the Nobel Prize.
Oh, absolutely before, fairly early, yes.
Because as you talked about, one could say it's a very unconventional love poem to his wife who was back in Ireland.
Right, it's an erotic poem, but at the same time it references all this religious imagery, and it just keeps us off balance and, you know, back on our heels in a sense, and I think that's what's so fascinating about it.
And that's what I admire very much about Yeats's poems, because on many of them, there's a sort of surface understanding, but then there's the deep meaning that often go back to biblical references or Irish mythology or philosophy.
Yep.
And the more you know, the more you can see the mastery, which I think Heaney also did in his poetry.
Yes, that's true. Yeah.
You know, as you talked about using Latin phrases from the church.
That's right.
I remember one of the poems you talked about in Father Graff's class, which you visited, was about Heaney sort of connecting with James Joyce.
Yes.
In sort of a spiritual way, I guess one could say.
That's right. In Station Island, that group of connected poems that he wrote, you know, that for the most part Heaney tended to write fairly short poems, right? Maybe a sonnet, maybe something a little bit longer. But this gave him an opportunity to write a poetic sequence that he hadn't done before. And in it, he is on this pilgrimage, literally on this pilgrimage, right, which has echoes of Dante's Inferno. And he begins to meet, not clearly in a realistic kind of way, but in a kind of almost surreal way, some figures that had been important to him from the past. William Carleton, who he didn't know, but he was a folk writer from the 19th century. And he meets Carleton. He meets, and one of the other characters that he meets is James Joyce. And James Joyce instructs him that possibly the road that he's been taking as a poet, that is Heaney's, needs some correction, that he needs to be more independent and strike out on his own. And it's just such a wonderful Joycean portrait that comes and goes so quickly. And Joyce just fades into the fog after giving him this advice, in a sense, right?
Well, you know, when Stephen Dedalus says history is a nightmare from which I'm trying to escape, I wonder to what extent for Heaney, Yeats was kind of a nightmare, because no matter what, presumably he'd be compared to Yeats, and also with Joyce in some ways.
Yeah, I think, you know, the critics like Harold Bloom talk about the anxiety of influence, right? But the interesting thing about Heaney is because he was taught in a Northern Irish curriculum, which was really a British curriculum, the poets and the writers that he knew first were not the Irish writers of the South. He came to Yeats fairly late. And you can make the case that he came to Yeats after he came to Berkeley, University of California. And he met a friend there who said, you must read more Yeats, you must read more Joyce, you know. And so I think there's the sense that Heaney was not overshadowed by Yeats, as so many Irish poets and other writers were, because he came to Yeats late. And he was reading British poetry for the most part, British poets in the canon. And so by the time he came to Yeats, he had found his own poetic voice, in a sense, right? And he could read him without that sense that Yeats was looking over his shoulder, in a way.
Yeah, that's interesting. And another point that you made was the fact that Heaney eventually moved from Northern Ireland, still part of the United Kingdom, to the Republic of Ireland.
Yes.
And I guess that generated some criticism.
It did. After Berkeley, he came back to Belfast for a couple of years. And it was not a good time, right? And, you know, and so there was the sense, I think, that he needed to get some distance from this, right? And also some distance from the teaching that he had been doing that had been so onerous, I think, in a way, because he was a junior faculty member. And so he took this flyer, and that, in a sense, that he took his family down to Wicklow to a cottage there, right? And what's interesting is, here's another connection with Yeats, that one of Yeats's most productive periods was when he took his family out to the west of Ireland and lived in this Norman tower out in the west of Ireland, and forced himself to live this kind of rural existence in a way. And I do think that Heaney was always, basically reflecting, or he's imitating, in a sense, some of these great masters that he had read, like Yeats, for example. And so there was a sense that he was deliberately moving to this isolated cottage in a way that had literary associations of its own. And he was going to test whether or not he could really be a writer. Now, at the same time, having left Northern Ireland in this situation, a lot of his friends and contemporaries felt betrayed. In other words, if you're going to be true to the situation, you can't walk away from the troubles that are happening in the North. And I think finally, and he doesn't talk necessarily a lot about this, but I think there's a sense that, why do I have to stay here, in a sense, right? If I want to be a poet, why can't I just go someplace and write my poetry and find out if I can really make it as a poet, in a sense, right? There was always this quandary in Heaney's life as to what obligation do I have to the North, to the troubles that are taking place? To what extent must I be a public poet who is always sort of reflecting the times in a way? Yeah. You see? And there are other examples in literary history. Auden left England during the Second World War, and he was considered to be a traitor for doing that. Went to New York and, you know, had another literary career. But I think it was a very productive period for Heaney.
Well, there's, of course, the Irish tradition with Joyce and Beckett of exile, and willingly exiling yourself, in part from an environment that is stultifying.
Yes.
Not only because of the political conditions, but also sometimes, you know, the pettiness of
That's right.
rivals or what have you.
That's
just
right.
the need to get away.
That's right, right. I think a lot of people, you know, when they talk about, you know, Heaney as a poet of happiness, don't realize the kind of domestic tensions that happen when you're trying to be a writer and yet you're trying to be a good father and a husband, in a sense. And a lot of the Glanmore poems, which he wrote down in, you know, Wicklow, reflect some of these tensions. You know, I want to write poetry and yet I have these obligations, in a sense, to my family. And there's some poems that are fairly, you know, they're quite sharp-edged, in a sense, right, in Heaney's poetry, about the somewhat, you know, the challenges of domesticity.
Sure. Well, of course, being a writer often means you have to isolate yourself.
That's right. When Lowell visited them at Glanmore, Robert Lowell, he said to Heaney, "You see a lot of your children, don't you?"
By implication, Lowell did not.
Well, yeah, that's right. But I don't know if that was the same time that he said to Heaney, "You write an awful lot about trees, don't you?"
Well, of course, that's one of the aspects I think that many appreciate about Heaney's writings is the nature aspects of digging and being with the soil, fishing.
That's right.
And I think it has an authenticity to it that perhaps some of the more urban type poets, even if they wrote about such topics, it wouldn't necessarily ring true.
And his credentials were bona fide in terms of writing about rural life because he had experienced it in the way that some other perhaps nature poets like a Shelley or something had not experienced the natural world. Yes, poet of nature, but also a poet who is very sensory in his appreciation of nature.
Yeah. The other aspect, you mentioned domesticity, you gave a series of lectures when you were in Ireland and Northern Ireland.
I did.
At least one of which Heaney's widow was in attendance, and I guess his daughter as
His daughter, Catherine, came in later. She had had a meeting that she couldn't avoid, but she and I had a long conversation afterwards. But the poet's wife, Mari, was sitting right below the lectern, And one of the poems that I was talking about, and we talked about this, was The Skunk, in which there's a large part about her there, because it's this moment of sort of erotic domesticity in the poem. And I was at that time somewhat apprehensive about talking about this poem in front of the woman about whom the poem was directed. But she's also a woman who has a wonderful sense of humor.
Yes.
And all apprehensions were sort of cleared away after I finished my presentation. She was very gracious and very generous.
Well, I got just from your talk and what I know of Heaney, this idea of domesticity, I think, relates to why he's been called the poet of happiness, because a lot of his poem, I don't know how to phrase it, but it seems like, you know, the joys of a long married life, the joys of the mundane, one might say.
Yes.
Which you often don't see. And many poems really express extremes.
Yes, and the other thing was not just domesticity, but the poet of family, in a sense, right? That he celebrated his parents in incredible poems, you know, very, very, very heartfelt poems, in a sense, right? And and he would constantly go. His early childhood and his early years, his early experiences, were a constant source of creativity for them later in life. In other words, he would go back and revisit these moments of family life, and with a new eye, in a sense, and a new appreciation, especially in a book of poems like District and Circle, I would say. So he was, unlike Joyce, who had a kind of jaundiced view of his father, you know, because his father...
Well, he loved his father as long as he didn't see him.
Yeah. Well, Joyce's father was a ne'er-do-well who squandered the family fortunes, et cetera, and was constantly moving them from one house to the other. But Heaney was different. You know,
of course, Yeats's father was quite a character as well.
He was, and Yeats's father sort of exiled himself to New York for a long period of time, and the family couldn't get him back because in New York he was a celebrity. This would be John Butler Yeats. And he made a circle of friends, and he had a kind of good sort of pub life, I guess you would say, right? Mm-hmm. And so the family just simply couldn't get him back. So yes, fathers and mothers in Irish poetry, that's right. And Colm Tóibín has recently, I think, written a book about, I think, fathers.
Yeah.
Yes, and Joyce, I think, Yeats, and I believe it's
Wilde.
Wilde. It's Oscar Wilde. Yes, Oscar Wilde.
Well, now, if I recall correctly, was it the last poem that Heaney wrote or was working on, where he was talking about his grandchild sort of dancing in front of him?
That's right. That's right. Yes, that was his last poem that he wrote.
That's very moving.
It's a very moving poem, and those last poems are very moving.
And as we've talked about, I happened to be in Ireland just shortly after Heaney's death, and I met some people who had actually known him, but most people didn't. But to them, it was like a loss in the family. I mean, he was such a beloved figure.
He was, yes. And there was a tremendous outpouring of grief and memory about him after he died. There's, as we were talking about before, you never really can meet a person that has a bad word to say about Heaney. That he was such a wonderful human being, you know. And I think there is the sense that a lot of his success as a poet was connected with the charisma that he brought to both his teaching and his readings, in a sense, right? He's a very charismatic reader. And you kind of wonder...
As opposed to Yeats, because I've heard some of Yeats reading his own poems, and they're a little clunky.
Well, they're very sort of Mandarin, I think, in a sense, and very, kind of haughty. But, Heaney was a wonderful reader and very charismatic. And it's been speculated, this interesting question, to what extent is the lasting power of a poet's poetry work dependent on their personage, their persona, their charisma. And, in other words, Heaney developed tremendous readership in the States because of his presence and his commanding ability to read his own poetry. And the other thing was he was incredibly a hard worker, and he was always on the lecture tour, to the point of really sort of punishing himself on these tours and really taking on too much, you see. And I think his friends and contemporaries, especially, not exactly at the end, but moving towards the end, thought that he was just really doing too much. He was just trying to do too much, in a sense. But in doing these readings all over the country, which is one of the things that I talk about in my book, he developed tremendous audiences, because whether they had read his poetry by that time, you know, they would go out and buy his books, and you know, his translation of Beowulf that he did in 2000 sold 200,000 copies.
Yeah.
Now, that's not, you know, it is a translation, but still, that's an amazing number for a poet. I mean, most of the time we talk about poetry volumes selling in the hundreds or something, you know.
Well, your project now is writing about his time in America. When was his last time in the U.S.?
Well, I can't say exactly, because it kind of trailed off. You know, I would say about the year 2000, he had positions at Harvard that would require him only come back for a month or so at a time in the spring. You know, and so it kind of trailed off. But certainly after the Nobel Prize, 1995, in the next sort of 5 years or so, his presence certainly at Harvard diminished a lot. And we do know that he said that he was thinking when he was teaching at Harvard that he might hold on just long enough to get a pension from Harvard. And but having gotten the Nobel Prize in 1995, he said, "I don't think I really need to do this
helps.
now." Yeah, yes.
And you, in your talk here, you discussed a poem he wrote about the 9/11 tragedy.
Yes, anything can happen. Yes, anything can happen. And I think one of the topics we're probably not going to get a chance to talk about is the sense in which Heaney wrote a small number of poems that are perhaps not his best work, because in a sense they didn't come up from the inner springs of his own sort of creativity. But he felt with the 9/11 poem, Anything Could Happen, that he had a certain obligation to write this poem because he had lived in the States for so long. But it was not what you would call a typical 9/11 poem. It talked more about the destruction of the Twin Towers as kind of a product of a tectonic shift, as almost like an earthquake. In other words, he doesn't really talk about the victims so much in that poem. And you know, if we had another half hour or so, we could talk more at length about that. But yes, and then there were a couple other poems. One poem that he wrote at Harvard called Villanelle of an Anniversary that he was commissioned to write. And interestingly, his friends, and I know two of them, I've interviewed two of them, they said to Seamus, don't go ahead with this poem. This is not the poem you want to write. Please, don't do it. And he did it anyway. And it's probably not considered one of his best poems, you know, because he talks about Harvard throwing its gates open for everybody. And of course, we understand that Harvard is probably a little more select than that, in a sense, right? Yeah. But I know in the interest of time, we would say that for another time. Yeah.
Well, we have just about a minute or so. Any closing comments about Heaney you'd like to make, or those who aren't familiar with his work?
Yeah. Well, he's an endlessly interesting poet who does kind of keep reinventing himself in a way. And yet at the same time that he does something new, there's always this sense that he's going back to earlier experience in a way, and sort of drawing on that sort of well of creativity that's associated with his family and early Ireland and childhood. We could talk about childhood at length in Joyce, in Yeats, and certainly in Heaney. Childhood, very powerful influence on Heaney.
Well, that's all the more reason to bring you back for another Art Community Forum.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Ed, for a wonderful discussion on the importance of Seamus Heaney. And as I mentioned as well, I'd love to have you come back to talk about what was your primary area of study, W.B. Yeats.
Yeah.
Who was another endlessly fascinating poet and
certainly true.
Figure.
Yeah. Well, thanks, Tim. I enjoyed our conversation, and thanks for this opportunity to talk about the work that I'm doing.
It's been a
Thank
pleasure.
you so much. Mm-hmm.